Thanks for tuning in to the Diaphragm Dynasty. I'm back with more R&B news as I do exclusively on this podcast. Just talking about or thinking about groups. I was thinking about one of the most forgotten groups of all time. One of the groups that if you grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s, that this music became a part of your life. It became a soundtrack to your life. If you can make a soundtrack, you have to put Jagged Edge on that soundtrack if you grew up around this time or even to present day, that music is still timeless and relates to today's time because they made music just like that. But when you think about the greatest R&B groups of all time, they're rarely talked about. You know, they talk about the TLCs, they talk about the Destiny's Child, Boys to Men, New Edition, Drew Hill, but rarely do they mention Jagged Edge in that conversation, and they should be in that conversation. And that'll happen when there's so much history in a genre or a particular avenue or organization or whatever particular industry you're in. That's going to happen. People are going to get looked over. But this is what this podcast and the Urban Scope podcast is dedicated to doing, is giving those flowers back to those artists that are forgotten and the ones that are not forgotten, just to give, overall flowers to everybody, to give everybody that show to everybody that type of love, because sometimes we forget, and that's being a part of being human. But it's not like Jagged Edge didn't have hits that are not compared to the greats. Now, when you hear when you think about their discography, the songs that they have, "I Gotta Be," "Let's Get Married," "Promise," "What a Party At," even "What a Party At" remix with Nelly, which is one of the best songs I've heard. "Walked Out of Heaven," "Good Luck Charm." These hits are timeless hits that been a part of relationship stories for the past 20, 25 years, that they've been making these hits. And some people, you know, probably think that, or there's some credence to it, when you're an R&B artist or R&B group and you're signed to a hip hop artist or a hip hop label. uh, some people think that's a detriment because, we've seen those stories of R&B artists and groups signed to hip hop labels. Now, Olivia being signed to G Unit, or Ari Lennox being signed to Dreamville, which she recently just left, and she talked about the downfalls of that. Cassie the Bad Boy. It's been a lot like that, but there has been stories of artists flourishing through hip hop labels. Now we've seen SZA with TDE. That's probably the biggest example. SZA has done well with TDE, and we don't even realize that she's signed to a hip hop label. She does a lot of collaborations with Kendrick Lamar and with other hip hop artists, but it doesn't even sound like she's sound to that because of their great leadership and their great productions and things like that. Ashanti with Murder Inc. That was huge. And even Omarion with MMG or Maybach Music Group with Rick Ross being signed to him. Omarion was able to stay afloat even after that amazing O album. He was still able to stay afloat and release songs like MIA and Supposed to Be and things like that. So he didn't see a drop off. He continued to ascend, um, even though he was signed with the hip hop label. So I think Jagged Edge being signed to a rap label is not the sole reason that they're have been left out of these discussions or been undervalued, because Jermaine Dupri is an amazing, producer, writer. He's everything. He's seen as hip hop guy, but had a lot of contributions to R&B, and I talked about that in previous segments here on the Diaphragm Dynasty. But I think Jagged Edge was just in a tough era. Being in the era, you had to compete with like the Destiny's Childs and TLCs and Drew Hills and even 112s who were signed to Bad Boy, a hip hop label. So they had to compete in a tough era. And even 112 gets undermined. Mostly when you think about groups, you're thinking about the TLCs or Destiny's Child. They don't talk about the SWVs. They don't talk about the In Vogues. All these other great groups. There are a lot of great groups in the 90s, and those groups told the test of time or told that the story of that time. Opposed to now, there are not many groups as there used to be because of the splitting of the pie and financial ramifications. But back in the 90s, it was a big thing. And I don't think Jagged Edge was promoted or had the commercial success of other groups of the time because they were more of a urban type deal. They had a more hip hop look to them, even though they used to dress in suits and stuff like that, and they had these love songs. But they were mostly seen as a hip hop type group, even though it was pure R&B. But They didn't have the look like the other groups had, but you can put them against any other group in the era, and they can stand the test of any discography. And I think another factor that most people don't consider about Jagged Edge is they never had a solo star. So, you know, Destiny Child had Beyonce, even Kelly Rowland to some degree. Drew Hill had Cisco, Boys to Men, um, or Bobby Brown or Johnny Gill and New Edition. They all had these solo stars that did great outside of the group and didn't really need the group. They can stand on their own. And now Boys to Men is the only group that I can think of that's been that successful and didn't really have a solo star. I know Sean Stockman started doing a lot of solo stuff with other artists after he left the group, or the group kind of disbanded or whatever. But at the same time, he wasn't the star that a Beyonce or Cisco or Johnny Gill or Bobby Brown was. But Boys the Men is the exception to that rule. But most of the time, you need a solo star in order for your group to get that kind of recognition. And then they never took advantage of the soundtrack or the soundtrack game or movie features being appeared in movies, because I never heard their songs on a movie or a TV show. And I think that would have gave them a different boost, especially in the TikTok era that we live in now. So I think that would give them some more appeal once they add that to the repertoire. I know they have an album that's releasing sometime this year, I believe. So it'd be exciting to see what that sounds like, especially if their sound is similar to what they used to be. But Jagged Edge is one of the greats and should be recognized as so. But hopefully they'll get that acclaim one day that they truly deserve, because they should definitely be in the Hall of Fame musically. But as always, until next time, I'll see you next time.